Hey everybody, and welcome to DnD Horror Stories with DnD Doge. In today's video, we have a story about a dungeon master running a Final Fantasy themed Dungeons & Dragons game that goes a bit off the rails. A story about a player that makes his character refuse the call to adventure, and much more. But before that, Nipsey has a quick message.
Please like, comment, and subscribe. Kick time.
Thanks, Nipsey. I hope they do that. But with that said, let's get into some DnD horror stories. A horror story that may not entirely be a horror story, or Stop Letting Me DM on Zero Sleep, by Reddit user Lexabuns. So this isn't a horror story in the traditional sense, but more one of me now looking back on the incident in question and going, but why did I do that? The only answer I have for that is that we had decided to truck into a 20-ish hour session because we knew we were nearing the end of the game, and my tolerance for BS skyrocketed at that point because things proceeded to get more than a little weird. For context, we were not playing D&D. We were playing a homebrewed Final Fantasy adaptation of Palladium Fantasy. At this point, I had been running games for this group for over 3 years. The party consisted of Dasha, a berserker, Richter, a dragoon, and Lo, a demon hunter. So most of this game up to this point had been pretty awesome. Each of the player characters had their own unique power. Richter could merge with angels, Lo could do something similar with demons, and Dasha could go full Shaman King with certain spirits that were callbacks to older RPGs that this group had played. And there was unique weapons, etc. I'd gone over and above to create what we thought was a good Final Fantasy experience. 4 crystals, secret weapons, hidden bosses, the whole 9 yards, and everyone was loving it. I had also established that, canonically, this world was connected to many other Square Enix worlds, because at one point I needed a pair of NPCs, and I just decided to use Locke and Cloud from Final Fantasy 6 and 7 respectively. That went over fine with the group, and good times were had. This is going to be startlingly relevant. Big monsters were slain, and we were building to a grand climax. There was a battle brewing in the entire world that the party would be arriving to provide assistance with. It was some real grand fantasy conclusion stuff. So we all agreed, instead of cutting game night at 11 PM like usual, we were just gonna push on through. There's no way this could be a mistake. This was a mistake. Right about 2 to 3 AM, the party was clearing out an underground lab, trying to find a lost weapon that would help them out. They come across an eldritch creature of darkness, where their weapons were ineffective, magic was suppressed, and they couldn't use their powers. Thus, despair settles in, and they're freaking out. I wish to God I could remember what I intended to have happen. It was probably something epic. They were probably going to unite their powers, discover some new uber attack, some sort of 11th hour superpower, the whole 9. But what did happen? My players were in danger of accidentally TPKing because I didn't want to just go back on my own words about this thing being nigh invulnerable. But luckily, my sleep-depraved brain remembered that their world is linked to other Square Enix worlds. And you know what is a good Square Enix world for fighting dark creatures? Kingdom Hearts. So that's how Mickey Mouse showed up in my Final Fantasy homebrew. I still remember the look on every one of their faces. It was somewhere between shock, horror, amusement, and interest. But we kept on trucking. And as I got sleepier, things just got weirder. Big series of boss battles? Summon NPCs to help from other universes? Sleep Brain says that this is a good call. Sleep Brain needs to go to hell. That's how they got to fight alongside X and Zero, Kenshiro from Fist of the North Star, and if my memory serves me right, I believe Ryu from Street Fighter showed up as well. By this point, we're all just sleepy as hell, but the end is in sight. It's now 4:30 AM. My second wind hits me, and my brain restarts in time to pilot the very ending of this game to the actual finale I wanted to have. It was glorious, bittersweet, tears were shed, and they agreed that that was one of the best endings I've ever churned out. But to this day, my players have not let me forget that I once saved them from a wipe that was 100% my fault by summoning Mickey Mouse to save them. I hope that this story brings you some amusement and entertainment. TLDR, really sleepy brain thinks Disney is the answer to all problems. Yeah, not really a horror story per se, at least not one you would expect, but I found it a bit entertaining that OP's choice to stay up way later than normal instead of ending and picking up where they left off for one more session led to an amalgamation of all these IPs coming together like Ready Player One in a fever dream-like climax. Though in the end, it sounded like everyone had a great time, and that is all that matters. That, and honestly, I wanted to make the thumbnail to this video. Let's move on. Accused of railroading by a player seemingly out of nowhere. By Reddit user NoProduce334. Hey everyone. This happened a few days ago, and it's weighing heavy on my mind, so I decided to post here. There are 4 players: Max, Artie, Sarah, and Jane, fictional names of course, as well as me as Dungeon Master. This is one of my first campaigns with an original story. Previously, I've Dungeon Mastered official campaigns, as well as a few original one-shots to build up confidence. Following the last one-shot, I thought it would be cool to move on to a longer campaign. I pitched the idea of a horror campaign centered around a haunted mansion, which people seemed very enthusiastic about, most of us being avid horror fans. After session 0 and some prep time on my part, we all met up to play. The campaign begins with the party meeting up at a harvest festival in town. They are hanging out and talking and drinking, and eventually, without realizing it, they wander off, away from the festivities. They find themselves on the outskirts of town, standing in front of a large dilapidated home, with no other residences in sight. Artie suggests heading inside to check it out, though the others are more reserved. Max puts his foot down and clearly says, "I'm not going in." They discuss a little and decide to simply head back home. Fine by me. That night, they all share the same dream of the house, which they realize when talking about it the next morning. Artie, once again, suggests going there and checking it out. Sarah and Jane are now also on board, as they're rattled by the dream and think something is up. But Max still doesn't want to. In the end, they agree to not go and instead have a drink at a bar, thinking it'll help them forget about the house. As they make their way to the bar, I narrate that as they get lost in conversation, they once again wind up at the house, as if drawn there by something. Before anyone can even say anything, Max once again goes, "I'm not going in." At this point, I am a little frustrated, and clearly, the other players are too. They all try to convince him to go inside, but he puts his foot down. Eventually, the other players decide to go inside without him and tell Max to, quote, "keep watch." I narrate both the events inside and outside of the home, and explain that while it's only been a few minutes of looking around dusty cabinets for the party inside, for Max, nighttime has fallen. Despite his friends being inside the house for hours and showing no signs of life, he still doesn't want to go inside. At this point, I try to come up with a different way of getting him inside. I mean, what else am I gonna do? Have him stand outside for the entirety of the campaign? I describe Max becoming tired, yawning, and struggling to keep his eyes open. I describe the house sort of coming alive, the front door opening gently, a dim light illuminating the entrance hall, and faint noises coming from inside. I describe an overwhelming urge to enter, and his feet moving on his own. I figured maybe he wanted something to force him inside, so he could roleplay someone, quote, smarter than a horror movie protagonist, instead of having to go of his own free will. Turns out that was wrong apparently, because Max cuts me off mid-narration to tell me once again that he's not going inside, and before I can even say anything else, accuses me of railroading the party, and him especially. He starts going off about how the shared dream and directing them to the house instead of the bar was lame, and forcing them to do what I want him to do. I'm kind of insulted by this, to be honest, but mostly I'm confused. It's a haunted house story. That's what we all agreed upon. I told him that if he didn't want to play, he could leave, but that the story was taking place in the haunted house, and that if he wanted to do something other than pretend to stand in front of a house all night, he'd have to go inside. He ended up not saying anything, and just got up and left. I'm not sure if he'll be back for another game, and I'm honestly not sure what caused this. Up until this point, he seemed to be having fun, and there were never any issues like this. After he left, the other players and I agreed that we'd give him some space before reaching out, and that we'd pause the game until then. I'm honestly not sure if I want to continue with the story either at this point. This left a really bad taste in my mouth. It just sucks, because I did put a lot of work into it, and I think the actual haunting presence is really unique. Yeah, I'd say that Max was being a bit of a standoffish player, to refuse to go with the hook of the campaign. I understand it could be seen as a bit railroady to try to have the players go into the house, but you kind of need to have a little bit of railroading at the beginning of a campaign in order to get things rolling. Max knew what the theme of the campaign was going to be, so should have made a character that would fit with it. Max making a character that would absolutely not go into the house would be like someone making a character for a standard D&D campaign, but making said character a housewife with absolutely no ambitions of adventuring. Heck, even then, a good player could come up with a reason to. Perhaps Max just wasn't down for a horror campaign, but just agreed to do it since everyone else did, instead of just telling everyone that he wouldn't be interested in that. Or maybe he was just having a bad day and took it out on OP. Either way, hopefully everyone is able to talk it out and figure out a way to move forward, especially as that campaign sounds pretty awesome, especially with the weird time dilation stuff. Let's move on. Player tries dungeon mastering for the first time. Other player actively ruins his game, so he wouldn't do it again. By Reddit user, Meet the Sea. So for context, I wasn't around for this. I am our group's perma-DM, but at this point of time, could not attend weekly, so every other week, my players would play board games. One of these weeks, our newest player, let's call him Barry, decides he wants to try DMing. Now, Barry isn't very ingrained in nerd culture, but he loves D&D, and he loves World of Warcraft, so he decided he'd literally run WoW in D&D. Not inspired by, just D&D in the Warcraft world. He asked me if this was okay, and of course, I said yes. I was more disappointed that I wouldn't be able to play. Anyway, game night rolls around, and Barry and the other 3 players set up. Barry introduces the world, and says the players have all been summoned by the king. Problem player, let's call him Joe, decides he's not into using a game for D&D, and is going to be a dick about this. He metagames hard apparently, given he's played Warcraft and knows the plot. I don't play WoW, so I don't know how bad he was. For the first 3 hours, Joe wanders off to random map points to witness events that he shouldn't. He insults high-level characters openly, and lures innocents into deadly traps. By hour 4, they are summoned by the king again. Joe then tells the king that he's going to try to do NSFW stuff without his consent. To the king. Barry kind of laughs it off, and carries on, but Joe keeps saying these things, and then says he pulls down his pants. At that point, Barry, still in character, has the king teleport Joe outside, telling him that he's banished, and that he's lucky that his team have saved the realm. Joe attacks the guards, saying that he can't enter the castle. 4 rounds of combat go by, and Joe isn't even trying to fight, just trying to go inside. He does, and gets to the king, who, after all this, uses power word kill and kills Joe's character outright. Joe says that that's a bad Dungeon Master move, but Barry and the other 2 players agree that he was warned. Barry then says that he should write up a character who is more heroic. So he does, and writes up an Oath of Vengeance paladin who is the child of his last character, and sworn to kill the king. Barry ends the session mid-combat with this random paladin attacking guards. He then quits DMing via text the next day and says to me privately that he'll never DM again. It was heartbreaking because he put a lot of work into it. The only upside is that I removed Joe from our long-term D&D game and replaced him with a few other players who were interested. This was about 8 months ago, and Barry still refuses to DM again. I later learned from Joe that he didn't want 2 campaigns running at the same time, so that's why he destroyed the other campaign. When asked why he even agreed to play, he said it was because that's what we did on a Wednesday. Yeah, that was a bit of a dick move on Joe's part. Like OP said, if Joe didn't like the concept of running D&D in the World of Warcraft universe, then he should have just sat out. But instead, he decides to play with the sole intention of ruining the game for Barry and the other players, and all because he didn't want 2 D&D campaigns running at once? That, and the way he went about it was so juvenile, and what Barry did to the character after pulling that stunt was reasonable, considering he was warned. It is a shame that this turned Barry off of DMing, but hopefully, he'll eventually give it another shot. Though, I wonder why Joe was booted from the main campaign. Was it because of this? Or did he do something else to get the ban hammer? Let's move on. Dungeon Master wanted us to act dumb as hell. By Reddit user PhantomBlade98. Pathfinder 1st Edition combats are brutal. Very little to no roleplay. Party consisted of a cleric, bard, fighter, gunslinger, and magus, me. So like most sessions, we get dropped off on a random island, and told to go into a cave. The fighter was going to be late to the session, but told us to start without him. So there is one big open room, and tunnels to the left and right. There's nothing in the room, so we go through one tunnel to find a small empty room. No puzzles, no markings, no creatures, nothing. And the tunnel continues to a second empty room. After a bunch of searching, we hear something following us. So we stop and wait, but it stops at the same time. We walk back, and it keeps its distance. We pretend to walk forward, and then sprint back. Still, nothing. Okay, weird. Maybe it's a puzzle that'll come up later. So we continue. We make it to a third room, also empty. We continue on, and we're back in the main room. Obviously, we have missed something, so we double back. On every search, all we get is, "You hear footsteps following you." We set traps, and we even throw torches into the darkness, all turning up nothing. The fighter finally shows up, and it's been an hour of real time, and nothing has happened. Finally, the Dungeon Master says, "You think it's waiting for you to split up, so it can attack you." Okay, well, we're obviously not going to do that. There's no incentive to stay, no locked treasure room, just nothing. So we decide to just leave. But then, the NPC captain says, "If you leave this cave, I'll kill you." We ask why, and he says, "Because I feel like it." Cool, So we say screw it, and split up a little, within a move action. Though apparently that's not enough. So we do more, and suddenly, one person gets jumped by 3 invisible monsters, who all get sneak attacks, and our characters are, quote, surprised. After we beat them, we get a treasure map for right outside, where there is a chest with thousands of gold pieces. We were never told that we were looking for this treasure. Well, that sounded like a bit of a boring session. Maybe the Dungeon Master just had the party literally running in circles in order to wait for the fighter player to arrive. But it did sound really railroady, as the only thing the party was basically told to do was split up in order for anything to happen. It sounds like this Dungeon Master just didn't do any prep, and isn't that great at improvising. Not the worst horror story I've read, but if most of the game sessions are like this, I couldn't see myself wasting my time with that type of campaign. Let's move on. 5th edition DM versus players. DM punishes players for using resources and takes out anger on them for skill issues. By Reddit user nshields99. One of my D&D groups came out of a session yesterday with tails between their legs after having walked away from a mega boss. The boss in question was a poison acid-themed dragon. Their gimmick was inflicting noxious clouds that prevent healing, corroding armor and weapons, and winning through attrition. The party took many sensible preparations. All of them had magical weapons and armor, which explicitly do not corrode if you use rust monsters or black pudding as a precedent. And the cleric provided Hero's Feast to become immune to poison. But nope. Apparently the boss had special venom that turned poison immunity into resistance, then eventually nullifying that as well. The party's magical armor that they'd paid thousands and thousands of gold to procure along their journey, all corroded and now useless. The Dungeon Master decided that the balance to preparations was, "Your things don't work." I was told that the boss also had some unprecedented movement speed. The highest challenge ratings cap out at 150. But the legendary actions took the cake. When the fight wasn't going well, one of the players used the Horn of Valhalla to summon berserkers. Then, and only then, did the boss use a legendary action in an AoE that regained health equal to the full damage inflicted. The boss regained 544 hit points. The party had no choice but to flee, all while the boss, Dungeon Master, said that they'd not pursue if the party willingly left behind sacrifices. One player insisted that this was a way to pick on them specifically, but they were the cleric too. Post-quest, when the complaints were made, the Dungeon Master claimed that they lost because they didn't find this, quote, special armor that wouldn't corrode. Sure, DM, sure. Dungeon Masters out there, please consider the following. Don't invalidate established rules, mechanics, and features to achieve balance, or you'll find the opposite. Don't ignore or outdo precedents for actions and traits without getting a feel for the math. Lastly, don't gaslight your players by using the player's own resources against them. They'll lose every time, and that's not what you should want as a DM. Well, I couldn't really put it any better than OP did at the end there. It definitely sounds like this Dungeon Master had a DM versus player mentality for that fight, and got salty when the players strategized and took precautions to help them survive the fight, especially when using that legendary action to regain that huge amount of hit points for the dragon. Then to say that they had to search for some special armor. I mean, did the Dungeon Master even give the players a hint about said armor, and or where to get it? I would think that if the players knew about that, they probably would have went for that first, before facing said dragon. So yeah, I think that this Dungeon Master just didn't want his players to win against this boss. Though, what do you all think on this one? But that is all I have for you today. As always, I appreciate all of you, and may your games remain horror story free. Until next time.